Welcome to Dataless You. I'm Paul, coming to you from Brooklyn. Today we're going to take a look at one of my favorite poems, The Snowman by Wallace Stevens. So let's get started. I'll be reading from his The Collected Poems, and The Snowman appears on page 9. The Snowman by Wallace Stevens. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost in the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place for the listener, who listens in the snow, and, nothing himself, beholds nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is. A beautiful poem. Stevens wrote The Snowman in 1912. And briefly, as we look at an image of Mr. Stevens, it's worthwhile to note that tragedy had struck Wallace Stevens' life just prior to the composition of The Snowman. Both his father and mother had passed away within months of each other, and also, possibly more critically, his wife had developed a mental illness. So the wintry mood or tone of the poem certainly mirrors an inner landscape for Wallace of sadness or even depression. So let's take a look at how we might interpret this poem. And today I'm just going to offer you my own personal interpretation, what I find in this poem so meaningful. One must have a mind of winter. The opening line is at once impersonal, given the pronoun one, a very impersonal note to begin on, and also intensely direct. The poem strikes a tone of talking to its reader, giving advice to its reader, suggesting how one should or even must be. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow. So a lovely image, the frost on the trees, on the pine trees. And take a close look at this verb to regard, because for Stevens, to regard the world, or as we'll see in the next stanza, to behold the world, is a very particular kind of activity. In short, it's to see things clearly, to essentially arrive at a kind of pure perception of the world through the subtraction of oneself and even one's, you might say, strong emotions or turbulent thoughts. So let's see how Stevens goes about achieving this, moving to the second stanza. And notice the first stanza ends with a semicolon, and in fact the entire poem is one long sentence. In a sense, it's one long, breathless, desperate thought that Stevens wants to share with his reader. So one must have a mind of winter and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun. Nice enjambment there. The line continuing from the third line of the second stanza into the first line of the third stanza, Another lovely image of winter, the junipers shagged with ice. What a great verb. And the spruce is off in the distance, glittering, the sunlight glittering off the snow. So the first line, though, of that second stanza, and have been cold a long time, I think rather directly points to the necessity of suffering, the need for a man to suffer. Perhaps in this case, Stevens is suffering the deaths of his parents or the onset of mental illness in his wife. So let's see. One must have this wintry, one might say stoic mindset. But for what purpose? Well, in order to see clearly, in order to behold essentially the beauty of the world, the beauty of the sun shining off the snow, the beauty of ice-shagged trees, the beauty even of a rather desolate winter landscape. Moving on to the third stanza. And not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves. I think of a cold winter wind blowing through the leaves, and again how desolate and despairing such a sound might make one feel. But Stevens is saying no, not to think of misery in these sounds. In fact, one of the great fallacies of poetry, it's called the pathetic fallacy, is that if it's merely raining outside, one not need to feel rainy inside. In other words, a simple image of a rainy day does not necessarily connote a kind of depression or rainy day inside the soul of the poet or the reader even. And so it's a powerful and beautiful message to maintain one's tranquility, one's equipoise, even in the face of suffering or of a kind of desolate landscape. The last two stanzas of this poem bring a kind of classic Stevens-like abstraction into clear focus. So let's see if we can follow along. So remember, we're coming from stanza 3 with the sound of the wind, the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land, full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place for the listener. Again, a key enjambment. We really have to read on into the fifth and final stanza to get this thought. And what is the thought here in the fourth stanza? Essentially, Stevens connects himself with the land, with the wind, with nature. Notice the increasing degree of abstraction as the poem moves on. We have a simple winter scenery in the beginning. We have trees, we have snow. We have mentions of being cold or of misery, but now we have this nifty move in the fourth stanza where the sound of the wind is the sound of the land, and the land is full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place. That same bare place may be the desolate inner landscape of Stevens, the bare place of his soul. And notice how this poem kind of operates like the camera that is pulling back in a movie scene, leaving our protagonist standing in the snow, gazing at the wintry landscape. But we, the reader or the poet, pull back and even further back, and we witness this scene. for the listener who listens in the snow and nothing himself. We better pause there. So the listener has become nothing himself. And to my ear, this is an evocation of the nothingness that is the very essence of reality, what the Buddhists might call emptiness. The fact that reality is a two-sided coin of fullness, of creation, and emptiness of non-creation. And that every moment is the kind of flickering on and off, so to speak, of this fullness and emptiness. So we have the listener who listens in the snow. He's become not even one who sees, but one whose senses are so acute that he merely stands in the snow and listens to the wind, to the leaves rustling. And our listener, our snowman, essentially, is having a kind of epiphany. He is nothing himself, but this epiphany, this insight, enables him to behold. In other words, to see clearly, to behold nothing that is not there and the nothing that is. In other words, our character, our protagonist, our man in the snow, has achieved a kind of union between his consciousness and nature, has achieved a kind of abstraction of self, or a self-overcoming, in which only the pure essence of his being, his perceptions, his seeing, his listening, his beholding, which to me is the sixth sense of his entire consciousness taking in reality. And it is so clear, so crystal clear, that he beholds nothing that is not there. There is no corruption of his perception. There is no impurity. He does not see anything, in fact, that is not there. And he sees the nothing that is, the essential emptiness that pervades existence. So with all of this in mind, let's end. And perhaps this time, as we read the poem, we'll just try to listen with the kind of clarity of mind that Stevens is talking about. So as we look at a picture of the poet, I'll read the poem one last time. The Snowman by Wallace Stevens. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place for the listener, who listens in the snow, and, nothing himself, beholds nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is.